My task today is twofold. I'll talk about poetry as a way of knowing. I just want to note my time here, 22, all right. Poetry as a way of knowing that you can think about alongside other ways of knowing. And my aim is in part to get you thinking about what kinds of knowing poetry enables and how that knowing shapes us. The other task I'll take on is to offer a particular poetic vision that answers the big question of this year's Ways of Knowing course. What are people for? And for an answer to that question, I'll ultimately go to the poet that I've spent most of my career writing about, George Herbert. He's an early 17th century pastor, who says in his poem Providence that humanity is the world's high priest. And when he says this, humanity is the world's high priest, I think he's being both provocative and serious. And you can mull that over, keep it simmering on their mental back burner, and we won't get back to it until the very end. But before we get to the answer to this question, what are people for, I want to take a step back and think about what poetry is and what it does. What is poetry for? Now, by way of an outline, I'll be talking about a few things today, a few poems. A song popular when I was younger, that remains powerful today, by Sinead O'Connor. A poem by John Donne, one by E.E. Cummings. Of course, a bit at the end on George Herbert. And along the way, I'd like to talk about philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty's idea of the chiasm and how knowing works, which I'll talk about in terms of eyes and hands. I'll also point out here that while I'm not going to talk about Rowan Williams' discussion of consciousness, which you've read, that also has been very much on my mind and has shaped this talk. So if you see any connections there, they're probably real. Okay, one problem with poetry is that it scares us. It's often hard to understand, and whatever we think it means often turns out to be different from what the teacher or professor says it means. It goes out of its way to be unclear, and why can't it just say what it means? I want to plant an idea here and return to it later. Poetry's capacity to say what cannot otherwise be said is one of its most important qualities. A good reading of a good poem makes something available to us that previously did not seem available. As Theseus scoffs, he's a good rationalist, in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, poets give to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. You take something that doesn't exist and you make it seem as if it does exist. Poetry makes something present, something that was elusive or absent or otherwise out of reach in space and time. Theseus, a good rationalist, is entirely sure he doesn't need it. But he is in love, and so. But back to the problem of poetry scaring us. What if we start with poetry that doesn't scare us and that usually doesn't get talked about in university? I've asked you to listen to Sinead O'Connor's Nothing Compares to You. And you may well be thinking, Paul, that's cheating. That's not a poem, it's a song. And that's true, at least the last part. Nothing Compares to You is definitely a song. And songs have rhythm. And if we stop and look, we could see that the words to this song already have rhythm, even before the music starts. Or to put another way, the words themselves already have music. I've been talking with my first year class about iambic pentameter, the rhythm that Shakespeare used, the rhythm that Emily Wilson's new translation of Homer's Odyssey uses, which works in this da-da, 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 da-da kind of way, right? Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy. Or Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? There's a rhythm there. And it's a rhythm that picks up on the natural rhythm of the English language. And if we look at Nothing Compares to You, you can see a pattern. The lines begin with rhythmic irregularity, unlike the lines we were just looking at, where you've got, and what I've done is bolded the stressed syllables, right? So you can see a kind of pulse. There's a regular pulse in these lines, in this poetry. Nothing Compares to You, each line starts with irregularity, right? It's been 7 hours and 15 days. But as you go through each line, you can see how it begins with irregularity, it's grabbing your attention, and then it resolves into actually this pulse, this iambic pulse. The lyrics to this song, as with practically all popular music, have rhythm. They cannot help but have rhythm because our everyday language already has rhythm. It's so deeply habitual, so deeply embodied, that it can only be noticed when you take special effort. But poetry, including song lyrics, we might say is a technology for noticing rhythm, and to go further, for enjoying the rhythm, and for practicing rhythm. It's like a practice of becoming rhythmical, or of being rhythmical. We are already deeply rhythmical creatures. Our heartbeat, our pulse, is our signature sign of life. In poetry, and especially sung poetry, we get in rhythm with another voice, and we exercise something that we otherwise take for granted. That's rhythm. You may have already noticed that the song uses another element of poetry, and that's rhyme. And it uses rhyme really effectively. And the song also uses repetition. It's not simply saying what it means, it's saying it over and over again. It's saying it over and over again with a building meaning, right? There's an accumulation of meaning that becomes more than what it simply says, or more than what it means. If we start to separate it out, we can talk about the song's meaning as one thing and the song's effect as another. What is the song saying to you, and what is the song doing to you? The first we can sum up. It's a breakup, the singer misses the ex, she is unhappy. But what is the song doing to you? It is giving you feelings that may run very deep. Some songs touch a nerve. We hear them and they become part of us. If we ask a music professor to explain the musical aspect of this, we'll get a sense of a whole complexity there. But for our purposes today, I want to propose to you as a premise of this talk that when a song has become part of you, there is poetry at work. I'm not proposing to you that you ought to start knowing things poetically. Rather, I begin by saying that you already know things poetically. And it is this knowing that you already do that I'd like us to think about here. Now, an essential mystery of poetry is that it is both intensely personal and in its very nature a shared experience. The more effectively the poet puts words to what they are feeling, the more those words affect the reader. Paradoxically, I cannot express myself as an individual without involving you. There is no individuality possible without relationship. This song delivers a message with astonishing economy, capturing the speaker's state of existence and imprinting it on us with a breathtaking clarity. And a great deal of that power is in the very old-fashioned use of rhyme, which builds slowly before hitting us with force. Rhyme here works to form word pairs, pairs that the singer hits at the end of the lines. Days, day or days and away. Want, restaurant. Choose, blues. I can go to whatever restaurant I want, see whomever I choose, But nothing, I said, nothing can take away these blues. Choice, our power to choose, lies at the heart of our sense of individuality, our personal freedom. And yet that freedom has been rendered useless in this song by these blues, blues that have arrived from outside of us as we have become entangled with another person, a beloved, now gone. With O'Connor's supremely expressive voice, these rhyming words land like blows, especially when she tells, when she gets to what the doctor told her. Girl, you better try to have fun no matter what you do, but he's a fool. As if there's anything to be done about it, right? The return of the word fool for do both echoes the advice and simultaneously pronounces it futile, foolish. Whatever the doctor may tell her, she is the true authority of her heart. Do and fool, you might notice, do not perfectly rhyme, but as Wilfred Owen and other poets know, a partial rhyme can create a stinging effect of dissonant connection. The partial rhyme here is exactly right. My point is that it is precisely as the words take poetic exactness, as they exactly get right the singer's heart, they land in the listener's heart. Again, expressions of the self do not happen in a vacuum. I cannot express myself without having an effect on another person. Thus, poetry, even as it is personal, is a profoundly shared form. I think we already know this about other ways of knowing, about other forms of language. We naturally think about scientific language as communicative and public. The strange thing I'm talking about is that the seemingly private language of poetry is in a meaningful, demonstrable, everyday sort of way, all the more profoundly public. For example, Taylor Swift writes songs that come from her own personal experience, and they become the songs of countless fans, expressing something personal for each one, and something relational. And I think it's helpful to distinguish two words that we conflate, which is personal and individual. These are words that do not mean the same thing, although they have a lot of overlap. Nothing compares to you as a particularly interesting this way, because though Sinead O'Connor made it famous and has become inseparably connected with it, she did not write it. Rather, Prince did. O'Connor was covering it, and the two did not get along well over it. What does it mean to have someone else sing your song? It is easy for us to sentimentalize the shared nature of our words, our experience, but it was tough for Prince to see that song become O'Connor's song. John Donne, who lived 400 years ago, has a wonderfully comic poem called The Triple Fool, about the experience of hearing another person sing his poem of heartbreak. I am two fools, I know, for loving, that's the first foolishness, and for saying so in whining poetry. Okay? Donne makes fun of himself and of love poetry. Love is foolish, and talking about it in poetry is a second foolishness. He does not say why yet, but it becomes clear that love, we might say, violates autonomy, and so causes personal pain. And yet, writing about this pain using rhyme and rhythm can tame it, right? You gain some control over the emotion. But the problem is, once you've written a good poem, then, but when I have done so, written the poem, some man, his art and voice to show, doth set and sing my pain. So, somebody comes along and sets it to music and performs it. And then, done listening to this, experiences it again. And by delighting many, the person frees again grief, which verse did restrain, right? If a song is good, then it pleases. And if it pleases, it sets loose pain again. And now Donne is a triple fool. A fool for loving, a fool for writing about it, and a fool for being the audience of his own song, and thus being forced to feel again his own pain, but now from someone else, as someone else's pain. Donne gives us a comically self-deprecating account of how we can be returned back to ourselves in another person, and how we can find that painful. Friendship has been classically described as having a second self, and this is good. But we too easily tell ourselves that our conflicts, our non-friendships, are based on difference. There must be underlying similarities driving negative relationships too, right? So of course difference is important to pay attention to, but you can't talk about difference without talking about similarity. Prince and Sinead O'Connor did not become friends when she made his song famous. They became strange to each other, even as they shared the same words. This deeply personal conflict between the two comes back to another important aspect of poetic knowing, which is poetry's capacity to speak of more than one thing at a time. Sinead O'Connor died earlier this year, and may she rest in the peace of God. And there were lots of articles about her, including about her conversion to Islam. I knew the one album with this song, the album I Do Not Want What I Haven't Got, from 1990. And I did listen to that album a lot, but I hadn't paid a ton of attention since, other than knowing her as a fearless critic of abuses in the Catholic Church, particularly in her native Ireland. On the whole, though, I suppose I thought of her as a secular singer. But the moment I thought about her being on a lifelong spiritual journey, then the song Nothing Compares to You started to read differently. One of the central convictions of Christianity and of Judaism and Islam is that the world is full of things that, no matter how good, cannot replace God or a relationship with God. That is, if we live in the world placing our hopes, our love only in the world, we will come up empty. In this particular sense, the world offers what we might call false consolations. Thought of in this sense, the song puts the point very well. Yes, the song is a breakup song, right? But this sense of, I can eat my dinner at a fancy restaurant, I can see whomever I choose, right? I can, any possible consolation available to the speaker is nothing, right? Because nothing compares to you. Yes, the song is definitely a breakup song, but it is not only that. And to push the point further, perhaps no breakup song is only that. This larger spiritual longing that is now so obvious to me in O'Connor's work has another point of reference. In this whole album, O'Connor was singing to her mother, who had recently died. O'Connor had a tortured relationship with her mother, who was deeply abusive, making her as a child repeat over and over again that she was nothing. So what I was hearing as a breakup song, what was hitting my soul as a breakup song, she was singing as a lament to the loss of her profoundly imperfect, damaging mother. And to get more interesting, Prince, who wrote the song, also had a deeply troubled childhood, one that shaped his own spiritual journey. As a young boy, his father left, and night after night he heard his mother pleading with him to come home. And Prince later said that he could write the best breakup songs because of this pain of a broken relationship that had shaped him so profoundly as a child. So one point here is that both O'Connor and Prince had a lot at stake. And actually, we shouldn't be surprised that they didn't become friends. And also, a crucial point about poetic knowing, that a poem can mean more than one thing. It is not that the poem is either a breakup song or a song about a missing parent, or a song about God. It is, and if you think about it, it kind of must be about all three. And this is as true of your heartbrokenness over a camp romance that's just ended as it is of those other kinds of loss and desire, right? Which is to say, breakups when you're young teach you a lot about grief. Poetry is always buzzing with cosmic truths. They are the truths that touch us most keenly. Okay, to move on, I would like to turn to a text very different from Nothing Compares to You. Different in tone and purpose, but also buzzing with cosmic truths. What I want to do is consider further the sense of shared meaning that we've been developing so far. We've seen with the one song how one person's sense of loneliness and loss becomes another person's sense of loneliness and loss, and in fact, every listener's sense of the same. And we've also seen how a breakup song can voice other losses, the loss of a mother particularly, and how in such loss we can recognize and name a spiritual need. But what if we take this sense of shared meaning further? I want to look at another poem I've liked for a long time that a friend introduced me to in university days that will help us see what poetry does with space and time. This is Somewhere I've Never Traveled. So far we've been looking at poems of loss. Nothing Compares to You is all about that person who is not there. We might say it is about an intense feeling of absence. But of course, there are also poems of presence. And in this particular poem of presence, E.E. Cummings' Somewhere I've Never Traveled, the space of the poem becomes more visible to us. Somewhere I have never traveled, gladly beyond any experience, your eyes have their silence. In your most frail gesture are things which enclose me, or which I cannot touch because they are too near. Your slightest look easily will unclose me. Though I have closed myself as fingers, you open always, petal by petal, myself, as spring opens, touching skillfully, mysteriously, her first rose. Or if your wish be to close me, I and my life will shut very beautifully, suddenly, as when the heart of this flower imagines the snow carefully everywhere descending. Nothing which we are to perceive in this world equals the power of your intense fragility, whose texture compels me with the color of its countries, rendering death and forever with each breathing. I do not know what it is about you that closes and opens. Only something in me understands the voice of your eyes is deeper than all roses. Nobody, not even the rain, has such small hands. Cummings, who was active as a poet from 1905 to 1962, he wrote on a typewriter, and the regularity of the typographical space, he uses that typographical space to produce a picture, as it were, of the poem's topic. He introduces irregularities, and especially removing spaces after punctuation. This one simple change gives the verse a visual compactness and intensity that matches the intensity and intimacy of its subject. He also forgoes capitalization and periods, not marking the beginnings and ends of sentences, and also makes the pronoun I a diminutive. The I is here, but subject to the action of the beloved, subject to the beloved. The poem arrives to us as a body on the page. One we need to encounter in order to understand. We cannot isolate its logical or objective meaning very easily, if at all. Rather, the poem gives expression to and makes present the intimacy itself, making present the beloved, or rather making present the way the speaker knows the beloved. This is the magic of this poem. It presents love itself, the condition of being in love, of being utterly affected by and connected to another. The 20th century French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, talking about being human, says, and I've read this quote a long time ago, and then it's been a favorite for a long time, that we borrow ourselves from each other. Right? He says that we borrow ourselves from each other. And we might see then that this condition of being intensely in love, as in Cummings' poem, tells us something more general about being human. Merleau-Ponty describes the way that we know each other as being like the way our left hand knows our right hand. We like to imagine that we know things objectively from a distance. We have knowledge about things, right? We know stuff. But for Merleau-Ponty, we know as we are known. So just do this with me. Reach out and touch your right hand with your left hand. Can you do it? Are you with me? Okay. Your left hand has knowledge of your right hand by touch. You can touch it and feel its knuckles and bones and the texture of the skin, right? But simultaneously, as your left hand is feeling, it is also being felt, right? Even as the left knows the right also knows the left, right? This is this kind of palpable knowledge. Merleau-Ponty calls this chiastic knowledge. The chiasm being a form that mirrors itself from the Greek letter chi, right? And chiasmus here is a rhetorical form that is kind of where the second half mirrors the first half, right? At night I stay up, but I just rearranged Sinead's words here. At night I stay up, but I sleep all day. So night and day, kind of envelop, right? The inner pair staying up and sleeping. But Cummings' poem is chiastic, but in a different but related way. Not so much as a narrative or a grammatical structure, but as constituted by a relationship between self and other, in which self is made possible by the other. Instead of describing the beloved or describing the speaker's own love for the beloved, the poem describes the intimacy between beloveds. And again, as an aside, if this is sounding too sentimental or romantic, keep in mind that enemy relationships are in some important ways just as chiastic as friendships. You cannot destroy your enemy, and this serves as comment on ongoing events. You cannot destroy your enemy without profoundly altering yourself, and that alteration is not for the good. Cummings' poem develops a strong chiastic sense of being known, of knowing as being known. And it does this by presenting something real, but at the same time denying us a knowledge that we can master. The intimacy Cummings describes becomes palpable to us through the mysteries of the rose. The mysteries of the rose, not a rose bought at the store as an objectively stable symbol, right? But a rose in nature, in the transformation of seasons. We know a lot about roses, but the life of the rose remains a mystery that either torments our desire to master knowledge, or that, as in Cummings' poem, becomes itself a way of knowing. The mystery of the living rose is a way of knowing the mystery of intimacy. Our very inability to comprehend the life of the rose becomes a way of understanding our own most deeply felt and formative living experience. Cummings' poem celebrates an intimacy that lays a total claim on us and that lies gladly beyond our comprehension. And some of these lines, you can see how much these lines work paradoxically, and they're there to defy your rational understanding. How does this poem make present the mysteries of human intimacy? How does it capture the ever-changing movements of the intertwining of souls? It does so through riddles, that which cannot be touched because it is too near, the power of your intense fragility, the rain's small hands. I'd like to move now to my second last point. How are we doing for time? Excellent. The chiastic knowledge of Cummings' poem is, I believe, everywhere in the world, but it is actually not granted formal authority. The authority in our world belongs to another kind of knowledge, one we can symbolize here with the I. And I want to start, though, you'll see where I'm going with this in a moment, right? One of the signature moments of Sinead O'Connor's video is when a single tear wells up in her eye, well, there's a tear in each eye, and rolls down her cheek. We may well have different feelings about this. Is this sentimental manipulation or simply the overflow of genuine feeling? I remember feeling entirely scandalized when an actor friend of mine knowingly explained that this must be a glycerin drop, the whole thing calculated prior. This was heresy to me. What for him was too much, for me was fulfillment, the completeness of communication. Either way, though, Sinead's tears or her tearful eyes help us understand something about how we know. Because the tearful eye is a chiastic eye. It is an eye that both sees and reveals, okay? I'd like to contrast Sinead's tearful eyes with another eye, the flying eye of 15th century Renaissance humanist Leon Battista Alberti, one of the greatest minds of his time. And this is when we think about the Renaissance man, this is the kind of thing we're talking about, right? This eye in the sky has a very long history going back to Egyptian hieroglyphics and traditionally symbolizes divine knowledge, the sense that there is a divinity that sees all. In the Renaissance, though, the symbol takes on an ambiguity. As Alberti's personal emblem, it may refer to the all-seeing eye of God, or it may refer to the primacy of the eye for human inquiry. In the subsequent years of Western modernity, the latter meaning has largely displaced the former. We still believe in a supreme knowledge, floating above everything, disembodied, and free from subjectivity, but that knowledge has become an ideal of human knowledge. The flying eye that we know best is that of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the Eye of Sauron. And this is exactly what Tolkien's after, right? His image is a nightmarish vision of modernity in which all the little people can always be seen, but cannot see back. It is the opposite kind of knowledge to chiastic knowledge. The floating eye knows but cannot be known because it has no body by which to be known. It is this kind of knowledge that the American philosopher Stanley Cavell criticizes when he reminds us that eyes are not only for seeing, eyes are also for weeping. That is, the weeping eye is not just a sentimental touch. The capacity of the eye to weep demonstrates that the eye is part of a body, a feeling body, a body that knows by feeling and by being felt. Modern knowledge tends toward knowledge of the cadaver, the body that neither sees nor feels back. And is this not how we treat the world and even human populations? Poetry as a way of knowing centrally involves beloveds who would know us even as we know them. The extent to which we do not take poetic knowing seriously is also the extent to which we've locked ourselves into a deathly way of knowing. Okay, so finally, as promised, to George Herbert, which I know you all came for, and his poem, Providence. okay? And we'll just touch on this briefly. But transition move here. One of the most famous flying eyes that we know of, right, is the eye of providence, best known to us from the American dollar, but also used in Christian iconography, right? The idea that God sees all, right? And its use on the dollar is pretty funny, but it's interesting to contrast the account of providence that Herbert gives us in his poem. So providence is this foreknowing and protective care of God for the world, right? We kind of readily imagine this as the eye in the sky. When we go to Herbert's poem, though, we see something different. Just before I get into the beginning of it, I want to just hit on this idea that I'll show you in a second, where he says, man is the world's high priest, okay? This must sound to us outrageously anthropocentric, right? Who are we to think of ourselves as that important? And isn't it our whole problem that we think we're so special? But I'd like to suggest that this line, that we're the world's high priest, kind of serves to snag us as we're walking by. It's like a nail sticking out that gets caught in our jacket, maybe even tears it a little as it abruptly stops our momentum. The jacket of our self-understanding. Okay. I think Herbert here is being provocative but also serious, and he's not describing humanity's importance as such, but rather humanity's vocation. Okay. Humanity in the 17th century did not need an ego boost, nor does the poem provide one. Rather, the poem calls humanity, with all that Renaissance power, right, to its particular duty, its particular vocation in the world, a vocation that is poetic in all the ways I've been describing. Writing poetry, yes, but also knowing chiastically, knowing from within rather than as an eyeball hanging in the sky. And the poem begins, "O sacred providence, who from end to end strongly and sweetly movest, shall I write and not of thee, through whom my fingers bend to hold my quill? Shall they not do thee right?" When we talk about God's care for the world as providence, we are already abstracting things, perhaps dangerously. If I say providence, then I don't need to get too specific about the God who is being providential. So notice how Herbert immediately gives the word a theological and spiritual vitality. Providence is not a disembodied knowing, but actually the vital presence of God in the world, giving the world life from end to end by strongly and sweetly moving. And so Herbert asks, "Shall I write and not of thee, through whom my fingers bend to hold my quill?" The poem begins with two acknowledgments of the life-giving movement of God in all things, this very moment, and further of the life-giving movement of God in the very action of writing about that movement. We see him looking at his hand, fingers bending through the strong and sweet presence of God around his quill. Decidedly, from the very beginning of the poem, the poet understands that he is within the action. Where does Herbert get this? The poem as a whole gives many signs that he wrote it as a response to, riffing off of Psalm 104, one of the great biblical songs of creation. And Psalm 104 begins this way, "Praise the Lord, O my soul." If you go to a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue, you probably say this sort of thing once in a while. But what's going on here? Why would you start a song of praise by talking to yourself? From Herbert's angle, what's important is that the self itself is involved in creation. The utterance does not take the self for granted, as we usually do. Instead, the self is a creation, a creature. How do you like being called a creature? The word in modernity has become derogatory as we aspire to greater things. But being a creature is a wonderful thing, for to be a creature is to be loved by God. When Herbert writes a poem in response to a psalm, he is reading the Bible as poetry. What does it mean to read the Bible as poetry? I was talking to one biblical scholar not too long ago who was saying that the Bible should be taught as literature. But for him, that meant you teach it with the assumption that it is not inspired by God. I think that approach is a real problem, and it feels too eye in the sky for me. Rather, the key feature of poetic reading is in how it locates and positions the reader. Poetic reading locates the reader within rather than outside of the text. It puts you as a reader into the path of inspiration, into a place in which you can feel the inspiration of Scripture happening. The church often seems trapped in a duality in which conservatives rocket Scripture passages around and liberals act as if they're above it all. But both of these are essentially modern positions, and poetic reading does neither. That's my editorial comment. Herbert's poem goes, nearly done here. Of all the creatures in both sea and land, only to man thou hast made known thy ways, and put the pen alone into his hand, and made him secretary of thy praise. Beasts fain would sing, birds ditty to their notes, trees would be tuning on their native lute to thy renown. But all their hands and throats are brought to man, while they are lame and mute. Okay, so you've got this two things going on here. All of creation is oriented toward God, toward praising God, but humanity has a special capacity. And here's the famous line: man is the world's high priest. He doth present the sacrifice for all, while they below unto the service mutter an assent, such as springs that use that fall and winds that blow. We are creatures and have a particular gift of reading and writing. Everything around us, all our fellow creatures, praise God, but in contrast to the human gift of language, they seem lame and mute. The human vocation is to present the sacrifice of praise, not just for ourselves, but for the whole of creation. Now, I've just subtly altered the poem. I've just said that the other creatures seem lame and mute, but the poem, you might recall, says that they are lame and mute. I'm not actually cheating. I'll just tell my first year class that. But rather, I am rereading these opening lines after having read the rest of the poem, because their meaning changes in the process. This opening emphasizes the difference between humanity and the other creatures in sharp and negative terms, making the point that humanity has a vocation that is not interchangeable. If we don't do it, it won't get done. But, and this is part of the reason the poem is so long, as Herbert starts offering the sacrifice of praise in a priestly way, that is, on behalf of the rest of creation, interestingly, this negation, the lameness and muteness, disappears. As the poem pays attention to the other creatures, it fills and fills with their presence, until by the end, the poet realizes that the human voice itself is not so much a necessary part of creation, but an extra gift, a gift that thrills in the pleasure of joining in the song of creation. And one of the key stanzas in the poem, and it's a lovely one, is this: thou, speaking of God, right? Thou art in small things great, and not small in any. Even thy even praise can neither rise nor fall. In other words, there's a song of praise in creation that does not lag, right? It's always there. Thou art in all things one, in each thing many, for thou art infinite in one and all. Okay, and I love that sense. Like this is a biblical sense of difference, right? There is both a unitive thing going on here and this wonderful diversity. The key is that this very process, from the taking up of the task to the profound paying of attention to the world, to the realization of one's own relative lack of importance, humility, as it's called, is exactly what Herbert means by priesthood. Speaking for others can only really happen from a place of humility within the body. The call to use the human voice to sing the song of creation can only be taken up by renouncing our and this is like a moment-by-moment practice, by renouncing our habitual position of assumed superiority to creation and our corresponding insistence that we are not creatures. That this is what must be renounced in order to enter into this vocation. Okay, to bring this talk to a close, this last point is the theological horizon of my opening observation, that poetry is a profoundly shared experience. The theological horizon takes those things which we know to be true in our individual and personal lives, the music we like, the feeling of connection with another, and pulls them into our public shared world, shaping how we live in communion with each other and in communion with God and the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. When we were planning this event, my colleagues kept saying, we have to have Paul speak because he's such a great lecturer, so thank you for the public lecture. We now move into our time of questions. So what we'll do this time, slightly different than last time, is we will invite you now to turn to the person next to you and two things to chat with them about. One is, what struck you from Paul's talk? And second, if you were to ask a question, what would it be? Okay, folks, thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. So what we'd like to do now, you have Janet on that side with a microphone ready to make sure that your voice is heard, and we have Rachel on this side. And if you have either a question that you'd like to ask, or just something that struck you, or perhaps you have a thought that you're not sure if it's a question or an observation, feel free to muddle it out and we'll find the question in it together. So we're going to take one at a time this time, not three, so please. Who would like to start us off with a question or comment? John Bupalan, thank you.
I hear there's a competition between faculty and students for who's going to ask the most number of questions. So I guess going to just got into the fight right away. Paul, thank you. I think you have persuaded me that, poetry is, to quote you, buzzing with cosmic truths. There was something buzzing for me that I wanted to maybe phrase as a question and get your thoughts. You kind of just slid it in there in your talk. So I'm going to just make that a little bit more explicit here. You said something like, we think conflict, right? I'm paraphrasing you a little bit here. We think conflict is based on differences, right? And then you are asking the question, but what if there are similarities that drive conflict, right? So this is a ways of knowing, of course, what it means to be human. So what does it mean for us to consider that, I don't know, that you and I have similarities that might be driving the conflict between the both of us, right?
Yeah.
So that's the question for you. Could you say a little bit more?
Well, yeah. So, in the first place, we end up fighting over things. I mean, the things we end up fighting over are things that we commonly value, right? So, in a sense, but I don't want to say anything just completely banal, about this, right? So, see, I don't want to make it seem like somehow, poetic knowing is somehow then a solution to conflict, because part of what I'm after with the Prince and Sinead relationship is that there was a conflict there, right? And it's grounded in something that goes very deep in both of them, and just because they could sing the same song doesn't mean they could get along, right? And I think there's something very instructive about that. Yeah, sorry, I'm not quite sure how to take this forward, and because it's an important part of what I'm talking about. It too has its limitations, right? This poetic way of knowing. I don't know.
You want to come back to that?
Yeah, let's come back to that.
Let's see another question. Yes, Sue, talk. It's profs 2, students 0 so far. So afraid of speaking.
Paul, you said that people are afraid of poetry at the beginning of the lecture. Is that because people are afraid of intimacy? Because there's been a lot of intimacy here.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, Sue is asking, since I said that people are afraid of poetry, is that because they're afraid of intimacy? I kind of don't think so. I mean, all of our pop songs so many of them are about intimacy, right? And we're really kind of magnetically drawn to those songs. So I don't think it's intimacy itself. I mean, intimacy is frightening, but I think part of the problem with poetry is that it has become a kind of it's become ghettoized, and it's kind of pushed off the mainstream. And then it becomes a little bit esoteric and becomes like a specialty, right? So that, when high school teachers try teaching it, it's difficult. It's this kind of strange foreign thing, right? And how do you break that down and engage it? Part of what I'm after is that, hey, we're already doing poetry. We're already listening to it. We're already singing it. And actually, it's like when you start looking at rhythm and rhyme, it's while there are certainly master poets who've got fascinating things to say about the complexity of it, at the same time, it's actually pretty simple, right? And so there's something that's that part of poetry that just appeals to you in a kind of seemingly naive way. That's actually the place to start. So, yeah.
Another question.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to articulate this. I really like the lecture, Paul. Thank you. I think I'm reflecting on your conclusion, and what kind of came up for me was thinking of the biblical story of Adam naming the animals, and how that connects with the poetic vocation, or with the vocation to be the priest of creation in some sense. And so what I like how this emphasis of our sort of involvement in the world rather than the kind of hovering above in the disembodied I. But I also saw in your lecture that you're sort of gesturing towards, the way I would articulate this is we often kind of talk about things like the human use of creation, or even more explicitly, the human rape of nature. And I think those critiques are good in pointing out the excesses, but I wonder, is there a way of articulating what a good use or a good making or a good way of speaking about creation would look like? If I don't know if all of that connects, but I'm wondering, how can you hold together this emphasis on being embedded in the natural world, while also seeing human making or human speaking as something that's good, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I perceive the problem to be one of a kind of, let me back up. We seem to be searching for a non-hierarchical way of relating to the world, right? Like what we're after is non-hierarchy. And I think what we do when we try that is we end up tripping over our own nature, right, within the world. Like there is hierarchy in nature. There is a hierarchy. If you know, somebody was saying, like, if your house is on fire and you run in and save your favorite plant instead of your dog, the rest of us are going to look at you like there's something wrong with you, right? And if you save your dog instead of your child, same problem, right? We can like, if you think about it in those terms, well, yeah, you should save your child first, then your dog, and then your plant, right? So this sense of, you know, there is, in fact, a hierarchy. And at what point are we have we as humans, you know, stopped doing what comes naturally to us? Like what is the human, what is natural for us, you know? So cutting down a tree and building a house, are we now doing something counter to our natures? Arguably no, right? So how can you tell if you're doing something? How do we even start thinking about doing something that is harmonious, right? Or doing something that is faithful within nature? I think if we want non-hierarchy, then we end up sort of, we're starting from a point that doesn't acknowledge our place in the world. And this is where I find Herbert and the biblical story helpful, is that it gives an account of a particular place in terms of vocation, in terms of an order, a God-given natural order in which we have something to do that involves use, right? Like we rightly use things. We rightly, you know, plant plants. We rightly, like all these things. You know, if we try to eliminate use, we leave ourselves kind of without resources intellectually to think about our position. So this account of, I find this account of priesthood actually compelling, and especially as Herbert works it through, where there's actually a position of humility that is possible within it, that I don't think we can assume. Like, you know, we're looking, even as we try to demote ourselves, like otherwise our attempts at kind of demoting ourselves as a species end up being perverse promotions.
Thank you. Thanks for the provocative question or comment. Another question. I see a waiting here. Oh, great. You've got the microphone.
You mentioned in your lecture that there's a difference between individuality and personal, and
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah. You know, this is a distinction that I remember Irma Dyck making this distinction years ago, where I was talking about something as individual, and she was saying, well, Irma, who's a theology professor here, was saying, well, I think I would say it's personal. I don't think it's individual, right? And I was like, oh, those are two different words, aren't they? And of course, if I can speak about the personal, right? Like I'm personally affected by Sinead O'Connor's song, right? When I automatically think of that as being individual, then I'm kind of defaulting to a way of understanding the self as autonomous, separate from, in distinction from others. And maybe this gets back to John's question, at the beginning, right? That there's this bond, like somehow I'm sharing something with, like Sinead O'Connor, there's a connection, right, that is hitting me personally that has a distinct reality in me individually, but the individual isn't kind of the master category there. So coming back to that sense that we borrow ourselves from each other, like that we are, or how Williams talks about there's no such thing as an individual consciousness, right? These things that we're actually constituted by our connections with the people around us. Does that make sense?
Another question. And by the way, this is a good moment. If you think the person next to you had a good question or comment, this is a great time to either nudge them to ask it or say it, or for you to just stick up your hand and say it on their account. So another question or comment? Yes, thank you.
Hey, I feel like you kind of answered it, but I just wanted, if you could elaborate more. I don't know if it's going to make sense. Would you say, poetry is an attribute of nature, or more just like a creation of our minds, in a way?
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I think in the biblical account, it is as natural as anything else. Although, what are we doing? What are humans doing when they're using language, right? There's this lovely sense in Herbert, and this is also why I like Homer so much, right? Is the nearness of inspiration, right? That actually, in Homer, the poet's always calling upon the muse for words, for knowledge, right? You're not actually going to produce any good poetry except with divine help, right? And that kind of inbreathing. At the beginning of Genesis, humanity is created by God taking up clay and breathing in, right? The breath of God enters the clay. That is the human being, right? And so that's where inspiration is such a kind of a crucial theological idea, even as we think about the inspiration for a song, the inspiration for a poem. And I think more fundamentally, so I grew up as a fairly conservative Christian, and there was a real suspicion of secular music, right? And what does it mean for a conservative religious person to listen to a secular singer? And I do think there's a more fundamental kind of confidence in that theological vision that that the life people are experiencing is something that flows from God, right? And so whatever the singer's beliefs are, if there's one senses inspiration, right? And this song is produced by Prince's own pain and by Sinead's own pain. But there's something just beautiful about their kind of reckoning and speaking, right? That goes to your heart, So that is creational, right? That is God working in creation, I think, in a theological view. Yeah. Good question.
Another question, comment? And again, feel free to poke the person next to you. In the meantime, John.
So I'm going to ask this question on behalf of admin. We'll have one question from admin.
That's the third team.
Yeah, they're team 3. One of the things I found really interesting in here, is the way that poetics appear throughout this. Because as an ethnomusicologist, I think about poetics as, when I say I'm going to attend to the poetics of something, or an anthropologist says this, I think they're looking at the surface of it. Like kind of what you did when you name the rhythms and so forth. They're looking, how does this thing produce the effects that it does? Like you have to pay attention to the thing almost as an object for a moment. And in a similar way, Merleau-Ponty and a phenomenological view, those hands are a really nice illustration of it, right? There's a surface level attention to sensation that then is imagined as showing something else. And you point out in that moment, in a lovely way, that you're tracing the surface of something very closely, and at the same time, why is that rhythm there? Because your heart's beating, because you're breathing rhythmically.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm wondering about this, about whether or not, and those rhythms, right? Like the rhythms you feel when you hold someone else's hand, you can feel their heart beating. You're not feeling their heart beating directly. You're feeling like the smoke to a fire. Right, the rhythm you get is the index of their heart beating.
Yeah.
It's connected to it, but it's like it's like an index. It's a sign. Anyway, so I'm wondering, can you say more about what it is to know each other through poems and bodies? Are we really learning who each other are, or are we experiencing something on the surface, or how do those things relate for you?
Yeah. This business of feeling together, right? It's a kind of I was just with my first year class, we've just been talking about two scenes in which people are sharing their pain. One is an enemy-friend scene, and one is kind of a stranger-host scene. And in these moments, people are feeling their own pain and imagining the other person's pain, right? And what I think is palpably true is that in these scenes is that actually there's that imagination of the other person's pain it actually bears out. There's actually something right about it. And so I think that's what I like about Sinead and Prince not getting along is that it stops us from the sentimental, easy answer, right? We both like the same song, therefore we should be friends. And it's like, well, no. But you do see the possibility of this kind of deep utterance being a shared utterance, right? And a possibility there. Yeah, and there's something about, I do think there's something about that, I mean, in the context of of Homer's Iliad, the whole thing's a war poem that the default position is that these are two different sides, right? And then it gets to the last book and there's this revealing of this profound shared suffering, right? And you realize it's not actually going to stop the war from going on, but you realize, oh, this distinction between these sides is not actually, there's some very important way in which it's not actually a real distinction. So, right? It's a kind of what I'm after here is kind of a way of understanding what's going on, right? And getting a grip on the problem, but not so much solving it.